It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend. I had just come back from a long week of work, craving nothing more than some quiet time by the water. My ranch, with its sprawling acres and a beautiful private lake tucked into the back corner of the property, had always been my refuge. So naturally, I decided to tow my boat down to the lake, drop it in, and spend the afternoon fishing and unwinding. I wasn't bothering anyone. No loud music, no guests, just me, my boat, and the stillness of nature. About an hour into my solitude, I noticed something strange. A car had parked on the edge of my property near the access road, far from the lake, but still visible. At first, I didn't think much of it. Maybe someone took a wrong turn. But then I saw a woman in a polo shirt and clipboard get out, pacing and talking on her phone. It didn't take long for me to realize she was from the HOA, the dreaded Homeowners Association, the very group that seemed to look for reasons to assert control, even if those reasons made absolutely no sense. I had dealt with them before. Notes on my door about the color of my barn. Warnings about the height of my hedges. But this was new. A boat on a lake on my land? What rule could possibly be broken here? The woman left after about 10 minutes, and I figured maybe she realized she'd made a mistake. I went back to my afternoon, cast another line, and tried to push the thought away. But I wasn't even halfway through my next snack when I heard it. Sirens. Fast. Loud. Getting closer. Within minutes, 2 sheriff's department cruisers pulled up, lights flashing, dust swirling as they came to a stop near the boat ramp I had installed myself. Out stepped 2 deputies. I was stunned, confused, irritated. I shut off the engine on the boat and slowly motored back to the shore, docking calmly while they approached with cautious but firm expressions. They asked if I was the property owner. I said yes. They asked for identification. I provided it. Then came the question that shifted the tone entirely. Did you know this lake is part of a shared HOA resource and not for individual use? I nearly laughed. My family had owned this ranch for over 15 years. The lake sat well within our deeded property lines. I'd even had it surveyed twice in the last 5 years. The idea that this body of water was somehow a shared HOA resource was not just wrong, it was absurd. I asked which regulation I had supposedly violated. They referenced a clause about communal water access. I asked them if they had a map. They didn't. I pulled out my phone, showed them the land survey documents I had saved, clearly outlining the boundaries and confirming private ownership of the lake and the surrounding 50 acres. The officers exchanged a look. It was clear they had been sent here without the full picture. When I asked who filed the complaint, one of them hesitated but then told me it was the HOA president. No surprise there. She had a history of inserting herself into matters she had no jurisdiction over. Apparently, she claimed I was disrupting the community with unsafe boating practices. Ridiculous, considering the closest neighbor was over a quarter-mile away and couldn't even see the lake through the trees. The deputies, to their credit, were professional. They took notes, inspected my paperwork, and, after a few radio calls, seemed to realize they'd been dragged into a petty power play. Still, the entire interaction had left a sour taste in my mouth. It was one thing to get nasty letters or petty fines. It was something else entirely to have law enforcement show up at your door over something so clearly fabricated. What really got under my skin wasn't just the false claim or the wasted time. It was the fact that the HOA believed they could intimidate me, manipulate my rights, and redefine ownership with a phone call. They wanted control over something they didn't own, using a thin veil of community rules to hide their overreach. It was a clear message. We don't care what's legal. We want things our way. That was the moment I decided I wouldn't just defend my rights. I would take it further. If they wanted to play games, I had every intention of winning and playing by my own rules. The moment those sheriff cruisers pulled onto my property, something shifted in the air. It wasn't just the screech of tires or the dust cloud rising from the gravel drive. It was the raw confusion and disbelief settling into my chest. I had done nothing wrong. This was my land, my lake, my boat. And yet, here I was, standing on my own shore while law enforcement officers approached me like I had just committed a federal crime. I kept calm. I always do. But I'd be lying if I said my heart wasn't racing as the first deputy stepped out and adjusted his utility belt. He gave me the kind of look usually reserved for trespassers or drunk drivers. The second deputy scanned the area like I might be hiding contraband in the bushes. It was surreal. I asked him if there was a problem. The older one responded with a question that still echoes in my mind. "Sir, are you aware that you're not permitted to use this lake for personal recreation?" I blinked. It was so absurd, I didn't even know how to reply at first. I told them, plainly, that the lake was on private property line. They didn't argue right away, but their posture didn't soften either. One of them mentioned a report from the HOA that a resident was illegally operating watercraft on protected communal land. Protected communal land? That was laughable. The lake had been dug decades ago by the previous ranch owner. It sat entirely within the boundaries of my deed. There were fences, survey pins, even GPS-tagged property lines, all of it proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that the HOA had no jurisdiction here. But the cops didn't know that. All they had was the complaint and protocol to follow. They asked for my ID. I handed it over. They ran it. They asked me to confirm the parcel number of the property. I gave it to them, then pulled up a copy of the property survey on my phone. It wasn't the first time I had to prove I owned what I owned. Sadly, it probably wouldn't be the last. As they radioed the information back to dispatch, I stood there trying to piece together how this all escalated so quickly. A simple boat ride on my own land somehow resulted in flashing lights and an investigation. I knew the HOA president was behind it. She had a history of overstepping boundaries, both literal and figurative. But calling the police? That was a new level of pettiness and power tripping I hadn't seen from her yet. When the deputies confirmed everything checked out, one of them let out a quiet sigh. He looked at me differently now. Not like a suspect, but like a man caught in the crossfire of some ridiculous neighborhood drama. He apologized for the inconvenience, but said they had to respond to every call. I understood. They were just doing their jobs. But I also knew they had been used by a woman with a clipboard and an inflated sense of importance. I asked the deputy if there would be any kind of report filed, and he said only an incident log noting that no crime had been committed. No warnings, no citations, no violations. I nodded, thanked them for their time, and watched as they pulled away, leaving behind twin tracks in the gravel and a quiet that felt heavier than before. But I didn't move. I stood there for a while, looking out at the lake, the boat still floating lazily by the dock, the water shimmering under the late afternoon sun. I felt frustration, sure, but I also felt something else, resolve. Because this wasn't just about one boat trip. This was about the principle, about the fact that someone thought they could weaponize the police to enforce rules that didn't exist. That someone thought they could override my property rights with a phone call and a fabricated story. This wasn't just harassment, it was intimidation, plain and simple. And while the deputies left with the matter settled in their eyes, for me, it had only just begun. Because if the HOA thought calling the cops would scare me, they clearly hadn't thought far enough ahead. The lake had always been one of the best parts of owning a ranch. It was calm, quiet, and untouched by the chaos that seemed to define life outside the gates of my property. When I first bought the land, one of the key features that drew me in was the fact that the lake sat entirely within the boundaries of the parcel. It wasn't shared. It wasn't part of a common use area. It was mine, fully, legally, and undeniably mine. Before closing on the property, I had done all the due diligence any smart buyer should. I hired an independent surveyor, not once, but twice. The first time was during escrow, and the second was a few years later after a neighbor questioned a fence line. Both times, the surveys came back clean, detailed, and precise. The lake was nestled deep into the middle of my land, with no adjoining access from any public or communal path. It wasn't even visible from the nearest street. You'd have to drive down a long, tree-lined gravel road just to catch a glimpse of the water. On paper and on the ground, the lake was as private as it gets. The deed mentioned it explicitly, the boundaries were clearly mapped, and the county property database listed the entire area, land and water alike, under my name. It wasn't just an assumption or something I felt entitled to. It was a matter of record, legal and unchallenged. So when the HOA claimed the lake was a shared community feature, I knew immediately they were either misinformed, delusional, or intentionally trying to stir trouble. They had nothing, no paperwork, no historic claim, no authority. It wasn't in their charter. It wasn't included in any covenant. It was simply outside their jurisdiction. But that didn't stop them from trying to assert control, because that's what HOAs like this do. When they see something they don't own but wish they could, they create drama. They invent rules. They weaponize authority they don't have. I pulled out every document I had. The plat map, the original land deed, the surveys, even a set of aerial photos taken by a drone service I had hired years ago for landscaping planning. Every shred of evidence confirmed what I already knew. The lake was on my property. It didn't touch a single inch of common land. There were no access easements, no neighboring rights of way, no shared responsibilities. The only name that mattered on every piece of paper was mine. And yet, somehow, that wasn't enough for the HOA. They circulated a letter to nearby residents claiming the lake was historically used by members of the association and that I was now restricting access and monopolizing a shared resource. The irony was painful. No one had ever used the lake except me and the occasional guest I invited over. There were no boat ramps built by the HOA. No maintenance was ever offered or paid for by them. They hadn't so much as tossed a pebble into the water since I moved in. But now, suddenly, it was a community landmark. I went to the county records office to ensure that everything was still up to date and that no odd filings had occurred behind my back. Everything was still in perfect order. The clerk even raised an eyebrow when I told him the HOA was making claims about a body of water entirely within a private parcel. He said that's a first. When I returned home, I walked the perimeter of the lake with my property map in hand, double-checking the markers I had placed years ago. Every single one lined up with the survey points. There was no ambiguity, no mistake. The lake was mine. The trees surrounding it were mine. Even the small boat dock I had installed was permitted by the county and approved years ago without a single objection from the association. This wasn't just about the right to use a lake. It was about the fundamental right to enjoy property you legally own without interference. The HOA didn't get to claim what wasn't theirs simply because they wanted to control more. They didn't get to rewrite boundaries with letters, threats, or false complaints. Property rights mean something in this country, and I had every intention of standing on that principle. The problem with HOAs isn't always the rules. They can serve a purpose when applied fairly. It's the people who run them that tend to become the issue. Power, when handed to those who don't understand its limits, often leads to overreach. In my case, the HOA had long been a thorn in the side, but up until the lake incident, their intrusions were more annoying than dangerous. I had gotten letters about the color of my fencing, the visibility of my trash bins, even the orientation of my satellite dish. Petty stuff. But when they escalated to calling the cops over my private lake, it became clear that this wasn't about community standards anymore. It was about control. Their pattern was always the same. Fabricate a problem, cite an ambiguous clause in the community bylaws, and bully residents into compliance. Most people, understandably, just gave in to avoid conflict. Not everyone has the time or energy to fight an HOA board that thrives on technicalities. But I've never been one to roll over when I know I'm in the right. Especially not when it comes to property that I legally own. After the police visit, I started digging into the HOA's behavior more closely. I reviewed their charter, their jurisdictional limits, the community boundaries, and even past minutes from their meetings. What I found was a consistent pattern of exceeding their authority. They had been issuing citations to residents for things completely outside the scope of their responsibility. Things like land use decisions, water access rights, even traffic complaints well beyond their purview. It was all smoke and mirrors, designed to look official, but lacking any real legal backbone. They operated through intimidation, hoping no one would challenge them. Their president, in particular, had built a reputation around being feared rather than respected. She wasn't elected so much as she seized control through manipulation, outlasting people until they gave up or moved out. Her tactics were slick, always framed in concern for the community, always wrapped in legal-sounding language. But underneath it all was a desire to enforce her will on everyone around her. That's exactly what happened with the lake. She saw me enjoying something she couldn't touch, and instead of asking questions or verifying facts, she sent officers to my property and filed a report filled with lies. She didn't have any documents backing her claims. She had no evidence that the lake was communal or protected under HOA regulations. But that didn't stop her from treating it as fact. She believed that the appearance of authority would be enough to scare me into obedience. She underestimated how much I understood about the law, and more importantly, about how HOAs function. I knew that their power only extended to what was clearly defined in their declarations and the homeowner contracts. My ranch wasn't part of their Phase 1 or Phase 2 residential zones. I didn't use their roads. I wasn't connected to their water system. My property was technically adjacent to the HOA, not inside it. They had zero legal claim to anything I did, but they were acting like they ruled over the entire zip code. When I confronted them, I presented everything: deed, surveys, county letters, and even a lawyer's memo confirming my ownership and their lack of jurisdiction. I demanded to know under what authority they had contacted the police. They fumbled through jargon, mentioned outdated maps, claimed historic precedent that had never been documented anywhere. Their narrative kept changing. One day it was about boating safety. The next, it was environmental concerns. Eventually, they just defaulted to saying it was about the principle of shared community values. That phrase stuck with me. Shared community values. As if that gave them license to claim land that didn't belong to them. As if feelings and power dynamics overruled paperwork and property law. It wasn't about the community, it was about the illusion of control. And I wasn't the only one. As word spread, other residents started sharing stories about being targeted with fines for things like having garden beds out of view, trimming trees without HOA approval, or leaving porch lights on past midnight. It was all about dominance, small, calculated moves to assert authority where none truly existed. What happened to me with the lake was just the HOA's overreach on full display, and I had no intention of letting it slide. The idea came to me not out of spite, but from a place of pure practicality. After dealing with the false police report, the bogus HOA claims, and their persistent interference in something that had nothing to do with them, I realized that simply proving them wrong wasn't enough. I needed to send a message that couldn't be ignored. I wasn't interested in petty arguments or back-and-forth letters. I wanted finality. So I looked at the situation strategically. If they wanted to control the lake, if they were obsessed with inserting themselves in a property that didn't belong to them, I'd give them something even bigger to worry about. That's when I started looking into the marina. The local marina was about a 15-minute drive from my ranch, situated on a much larger body of water that the HOA often referenced as part of their community waterfront plan. It wasn't technically under their control, but they liked to act like it was. Their brochures featured photos of the docks. Their events often happened nearby. It had become something of a symbolic space, one they pointed to with pride, even though it was privately operated and leased by a handful of investors who rarely even showed up. I reached out to a friend in commercial real estate and asked if he could discreetly find out whether the marina was for sale. To my surprise, not only was it available, but the owners were actively looking to unload it. The place needed some repairs, insurance costs were climbing, and the return on investment wasn't great anymore. They were tired of managing it and didn't want to deal with the constant community requests and HOA drama either. Within a week, I had a meeting set up. The marina wasn't cheap, but it wasn't out of reach either. I ran the numbers, looked at the value of the land, the potential for improvement, and what kind of message the purchase would send. It didn't take long to make a decision. I moved forward with the acquisition, working with a lawyer to ensure everything was airtight and the deal remained confidential until closing. The final paperwork took about 30 days, during which time the HOA continued to send me emails about unauthorized water use and pending review of community boating guidelines. They had no idea what was coming. When the deal finally went through, I didn't make a public announcement. I didn't gloat or throw in their faces. I simply had the signage updated, the records filed with the county, and the access logs changed. I now own the marina. The boat slips, the dock leases, the gate codes, everything. What had once been a community bragging point was now private property under my name, and I had full discretion over how it was operated. It didn't take long for the HOA to notice. A few residents called to ask why their key fobs stopped working. Others found no trespassing signs where the event board used to be. Confused emails started circulating, followed by an emergency HOA meeting that I was, of course, not invited to. Then came the calls. First polite, then frantic, then angry. I wasn't being vindictive. I didn't revoke access just to make a point. But I did initiate a full review of every unofficial use agreement tied to the Marina, especially anything the HOA had been leveraging without a formal contract. Most of it had been informal arrangements, handshake deals that were never documented or legally enforceable. And when I asked them to produce paperwork proving their right to host events or grant resident access, they couldn't, because it didn't exist. Owning the Marina shifted the balance completely. Suddenly, the same people who had tried to police my private lake were asking for permission to host fishing tournaments and community barbecues. They wanted to negotiate. They wanted to talk. The tone changed overnight. The woman who had once called the police on me was now emailing my assistant requesting a collaborative partnership between stakeholders. All I had done was purchase something that had always been available to anyone with initiative and resources. But the impact was seismic. The Marina wasn't just a property, it was leverage. And for the first time, I had the upper hand in a way they couldn't dispute. It wasn't about ego or revenge. It was about control, and more importantly, about setting boundaries that no HOA could cross again. Once the Marina purchase was finalized and word began to spread through the community, everything started to shift. The very people who had tried to corner me with bylaws and hollow authority were now scrambling to adjust their approach. It was a clear demonstration of what happens when someone stops playing defense and starts making strategic moves of their own. I didn't need to argue anymore. I didn't need to raise my voice in HOA meetings or respond to baseless citations. The balance of power had changed, and I didn't have to do anything except let the reality of ownership speak for itself. It started with subtle changes. The HOA stopped sending me letters. The weekly newsletters that used to carry passive-aggressive references to community members who refused to comply suddenly became a lot more vague. Their tone shifted from authoritarian to diplomatic. At first, I ignored it. I figured it was just temporary, a pause while they tried to regroup. But then I started receiving requests for sit-downs, invitations to coffee, and long emails asking for my input on future community policies. Suddenly, I was no longer the unruly resident with a boat. I was a key stakeholder in the neighborhood. The irony wasn't lost on me. The same woman who had confidently called the police and filed false complaints was now reaching out to me with proposals for collaboration. She talked about unity, mutual benefit, the importance of a strong, respectful relationship between property owners and the HOA. It was almost comical how quickly her tune had changed. And while I could have easily dismissed her and walked away, I chose a different route. I didn't just want the HOA to leave me alone. I wanted them to understand that they had limits. That's why I decided to attend one of their meetings unannounced. I walked in with documents in hand. Ownership records, maps, legal memos, and a full breakdown of the Marina operations. I didn't raise my voice or confront anyone. I simply laid everything out methodically and without emotion. I explained the chain of events that led me there, the false claims they had made, the legal boundaries they had ignored, and how easily it all could have been avoided if they'd just respected my rights from the beginning. The room was quiet, embarrassed even. A few board members looked away while others fidgeted with their notes. But they listened, and that was the first real change I'd seen from them. They weren't responding to a complaint or an accusation. They were being shown, in no uncertain terms, that their authority had limits and their actions had consequences. In the weeks that followed, I noticed even more changes. The HOA board updated their online documents to more clearly outline their actual jurisdiction. They sent out a notice retracting prior claims about shared waterfront access. They even held a community Q&A, something they hadn't done in years, where residents could ask real questions without being shut down or dismissed. Whether they admitted it or not, The experience had forced them to confront the reality that not everything within a zip code falls under their rulebook. The best part, though, was hearing from other residents. People I'd never spoken to before stopped me in town or waved as I passed their property. Some thanked me for standing up to the HOA. Others shared stories of similar harassment, fines for backyard sheds, threats over driveway materials, even penalties for not trimming hedges to a specific height. It was clear my experience wasn't isolated. The difference was I had pushed back hard enough to create space for others to breathe. My goal was never to become a symbol or to lead a neighborhood rebellion. I just wanted to use my land in peace. But by turning the tables on the HOA, I had shown what was possible when you stop playing by their fear-based playbook and start asserting your rights. I didn't need to argue with them, beg for exceptions, or respond to every petty rule they threw my way. I had taken back control in the most effective way possible by understanding the system better than they did and using it to draw a line they couldn't cross again.